The afternoon sun pierced through the dusty panes of the bay window, casting long, skeletal shadows across the living room of the old estate. For 40 years, this house had been a sanctuary of warmth, laughter, and the gentle, grounding presence of Maria. Her essence still lingered in the faint scent of dried lavender that clung to the velvet armchairs, in the soft indentation on the sofa where she used to sit, knitting sweaters while the winter wind howled outside. Buford stood in the center of the room, his calloused hands resting on the back of his wife's favorite rocking chair. His fingers traced the worn wood, a silent physical anchor against the storm that was gathering right in front of him. Across the room stood Ethan, his only son, a young man whose sharp features and impeccable, tailored suit spoke of an entirely different world, a world of cold corporate glass, ruthless calculations, and unyielding ambition. Ethan held a sleek, metallic tablet in his hands, his fingers tapping against the screen with a clinical, detached rhythm. He didn't look at the family photos lining the mantelpiece. He didn't look at the oil painting of his mother that hung above the fireplace. His eyes were fixed solely on the glowing numbers reflected in his pupils. "It's a done deal, Dad," Ethan said, his voice entirely devoid of any warmth, slicing through the heavy silence of the room like a scalpel. "The digital signatures are verified. The property deeds, the land titles, the offshore savings accounts, and the remaining trust funds, everything has been legally transferred under the umbrella of Apex Innovations. As of exactly 10 minutes ago, you no longer own this house. You no longer own the land. You own nothing." Buford felt the words hit his chest like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He gripped the rocking chair tighter, his knuckles turning white. He looked at his son, searching the young man's face for any flicker of hesitation, any remnant of the boy he had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy he had stayed up with through feverish nights. But there was nothing there but a chilling, corporate vacancy. "Ethan," Buford's voice was a low, gravelly whisper, trembling with a mixture of profound shock and rising disbelief. "What are you saying? This is our home. This is the house I built with my own hands before you were even born. Your mother and I poured our entire lives into this place. Every brick, every beam, it belongs to our family history." Ethan let out a short, mocking laugh, a sharp sound that echoed uncomfortably against the high ceilings. He finally looked up from his tablet, tossing it carelessly onto the antique coffee table, right on top of a lace doily that Maria had crocheted. "Family history doesn't pay dividends, Dad," Ethan scoffed, crossing his arms and stepping closer, his posture radiating a calculated dominance. "Let's be entirely honest with ourselves for once. You're 65 years old. In the grand scheme of modern economics, you are obsolete. You spent the last 3 years rotting away in this museum of grief, crying over Mom, doing absolutely nothing to grow your capital. You're a relic of a bygone era. You couldn't even manage the funds to keep Mom alive when her illness took over, and I'm not about to let your stagnation drag my future down into the dirt." The mention of Maria was a knife twisted deep into an unhealed wound. Buford's chest heaved, a sudden, dangerous surge of adrenaline flooding his veins. The sorrow in his eyes instantly hardened into a fierce, protective glare. He took a step forward, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with an intensity that made the crystal glasses in the cabinet hum. "Do not dare bring your mother's name into your corporate filth," Buford whispered, the sheer weight of his command causing Ethan to blink in temporary surprise. "Your mother gave you everything. She starved herself so you could attend the finest preparatory academies. She prayed for your success every single night. If she were standing here today, she would be utterly disgusted by the monster you have allowed your greed to turn you into." Ethan's face tightened, his eyes narrowing as his pride was pricked. But he quickly recovered his composure, adjusting the cuffs of his designer jacket with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. "Mom is dead, Dad. She's gone, and she's not coming back to save you," Ethan said coldly, his tone dripping with venomous pragmatism. "Reality is what matters now, and the reality is that you are a failure who lived a life of total mediocrity. I needed the liquidity from this estate to secure the final round of venture capital for Apex Innovations. I needed a launch pad and you were just sitting on a gold mine, doing nothing with it. Consider this your official retirement notice. A clean, permanent break from a father who has nothing left to offer the world. Ethan picked up his tablet, slid it into his leather briefcase, and turned on his heel. He walked toward the heavy oak front door, his leather shoes clicking loudly against the polished floorboards. At the threshold, he stopped, looking back over his shoulder one last time at the elderly man standing amidst the ruins of his life. "Don't worry about packing your things today," Ethan added casually. "The moving crew arrives at 8 a.m. sharp on Monday. I've arranged for a standard state-funded studio apartment for you on the outskirts of the industrial district. It's small, but it's exactly what a man of your standing requires. Goodbye, Dad." With that final dismissive sentence, Ethan stepped out and slammed the heavy oak door. The sound boomed through the empty halls, a definitive, resonant punctuation mark that signaled the absolute end of Buford's past. Buford stood entirely still for a long time, the silence returning to the house like a heavy, suffocating blanket. His knees buckled slightly, and he slowly sank into Maria's favorite armchair. He stared at his hands, rough, deeply lined, and scarred from decades of honest, back-breaking labor in the city's old shipping yards. He had sacrificed his health, his youth, and his own dreams to ensure that his son would never know the sting of poverty. He had handed Ethan the keys to a kingdom built on love, and in return, Ethan had used those very keys to lock him out in the cold. The betrayal felt like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest, threatening to crush his spirit entirely. He looked up at the mantelpiece, his eyes finding the small, silver-framed photograph of Maria taken on their 20th anniversary. She was laughing, her eyes bright with a vibrant, unshakable joy. As Buford stared into the eyes of his late wife, the crushing weight of his despair began to shift. The sorrow didn't vanish, but it began to crystallize, transforming into a cold, hard, and terrifyingly focused resolve. The tears in his eyes dried up, replaced by a steady, burning fire. He realized that if he gave up now, if he allowed Ethan to erase him, he would be allowing his son to erase everything that he and Maria had ever lived for. "You think I am finished, Ethan?" Buford said aloud to the empty room, his voice no longer trembling. It was steady, resonant, and laced with an icy authority that hadn't surfaced in decades. "You think because you understand algorithms and venture capital that you understand power? You think you can strip me of my dignity and throw me away like garbage? You have no idea what it means to build something from nothing. You have no idea what I am truly capable of." Buford stood up from the chair. He didn't look back at the room. He walked to the mantelpiece, took the silver-framed photograph of Maria, and slid it into the inside pocket of his coat, right next to his heart. He walked out of the house, leaving behind the physical walls, but carrying the unshakable foundation of his soul. Buford did not go to the squalid apartment his son had assigned to him. Instead, he took the absolute last remnant of his personal independence, a modest, forgotten life insurance policy that Maria had established in her youth, a small sum that Ethan's corporate lawyers had overlooked in their haste to seize the major assets. It wasn't a fortune, but to a man who knew how to stretch a single dollar into a mile of progress, it was more than enough. He walked through the bustling streets of the city's premier commercial district, a sprawling metropolis of towering glass skyscrapers, neon advertisements, and millions of people rushing blindly through their daily routines. Right in the epicenter of this financial jungle stood the newly erected headquarters of Apex Innovations, a towering, 70-story monolith of black glass and chrome, reflecting the gray sky like a monument to human arrogance. Directly across the street from the main entrance of Apex Innovations sat a small, neglected, and heavily dilapidated two-story storefront. It had been abandoned for nearly a decade, its windows boarded up with rotting plywood, its brick facade covered in layers of urban grime and faded graffiti. To the average real estate developer, it was an eyesore destined for demolition. To Buford, it was a tactical fortress. Using the entirety of his remaining funds, Buford tracked down the absentee landlord and signed a long-term lease on the property. The landlord laughed as he handed over the keys, convinced that the elderly man would lose everything within a month. The very next morning, the transformation began. Buford did not hire contractors, designers, or laborers. He could not afford them. And more importantly, he wanted every single square inch of this place to be forged by his own hands. He moved a small canvas cot into the dark, windowless back room of the building. He survived on basic rations, bread, black coffee, and water. For 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, Buford worked with an intensity that defied his age. The sound of his hammer, his saw, and his sander became a constant rhythm that echoed through the alleyways. He tore down the rotting plywood from the front windows, exposing the interior to the natural light. He spent 3 days on his knees with a wire brush and a bucket of chemical solvent, scrubbing layers of decades-old grease and dirt off the original, underlying red brick walls until they glowed with a rich, historic warmth. He sourced reclaimed oak timber from old shipping pallets and demolished barns, spending hours sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk, using it to construct a massive, wraparound service counter that dominated the front room. He painted the remaining walls a deep, regal emerald green, the exact shade of the dress Maria had worn on the night he proposed to her. He scavenged flea markets and estate sales during the dead of night, finding vintage, deeply comfortable leather armchairs, solid brass light fixtures, and antique wooden tables that possessed a character no modern factory could ever replicate. Through the massive front glass windows of his developing shop, Buford could look directly across the street into the lobby of Apex Innovations. Every single day, he watched Ethan step out of sleek black town cars, surrounded by sycophants, lawyers, and investors, his head held high with an insufferable air of unearned victory. Ethan never looked across the street. To Ethan, the dilapidated storefront was invisible, an insignificant speck of dust beneath his corporate boots. After 2 months of ceaseless, exhausting labor, the day finally arrived. Buford stood in the center of the room, wearing a crisp, snow-white linen apron over a dark tailored shirt. The transformation was absolute. The space was no longer a ruined storefront. It was a sanctuary. He had named it Maria's Haven. The air inside was thick with a rich, intoxicating aroma of premium, locally roasted coffee beans, mingled with the sweet, comforting scent of freshly baked cinnamon pastries and vanilla tarts that Buford had learned to bake from his wife's old handwritten recipe book. The brass fixtures cast a warm, golden glow across the polished oak counter and the rich emerald walls. It felt like a home. It felt like a soul. Buford walked to the front door, flipped the heavy brass sign from closed to open, and stepped back. On the top floor of the Apex Innovations Tower, in an office that overlooked the entire skyline, Ethan stood by his floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a glass of expensive scotch. His business partner, Marcus, walked into the room, holding a tablet. "Hey, Ethan, look down there," Marcus said, pointing out the window toward the street below. Someone actually opened a business in that old, decrepit building across the street. Looks like a coffee shop or something. Ethan walked closer to the glass, peering down. His eyes adjusted, focusing on the sign that read Maria's Haven. His jaw tightened slightly as he recognized the solitary, upright figure of his father standing just inside the glass. A look of profound amusement and disdain crossed Ethan's face. "Unbelievable," Ethan muttered, taking a sip of his drink and shaking his head. "Look at the old man, playing shopkeeper." He took whatever pathetic scrap of money he had left and poured it into a generic coffee shop in the most expensive commercial district in the state. He'll be completely bankrupt before the next fiscal quarter. He doesn't understand that modern business is driven by metrics, scalability, and digital integration. A sentimental little cafe is a joke. Ignore him, Marcus. He's completely irrelevant. But Ethan's corporate education had left a massive blind spot in his understanding of human nature. He did not understand that in a world increasingly dominated by cold, sterile, and digital interactions, people were starving for authenticity. They were starving for a place that felt real. The first few customers who walked into Maria's Haven were low-level office clerks looking for a quick caffeine fix. But the moment they stepped through the door, they were enveloped by an experience they had never encountered in the city. Buford didn't use automated ordering kiosks or digital screens. He stood behind the counter, looked every single customer directly in the eyes, and greeted them with a genuine, deep warmth. He remembered their names. He remembered how they liked their drinks. He asked about their families, their days, their worries, and he actually listened. The coffee was spectacular, rich and bold, served in heavy ceramic mugs that felt substantial in the hand. The pastries were heavenly, a comforting reminder of childhood homes and simpler times. Word of mouth spread through the financial district like wildfire. Within 3 weeks, the morning line for Maria's Haven stretched out the door and down the block. Mid-level executives began skipping their corporate cafeterias to sit in Buford's leather armchairs. High-profile lifestyle influencers discovered the shop, posting photos of the beautiful emerald walls and the vintage decor, calling it the soul of the city. Buford's revenue began to skyrocket. He didn't reinvest the money in digital advertising or corporate expansion. Instead, he invested it in quality. He hired the city's most talented, passionate baristas, paying them double the industry standard to ensure their loyalty and flawless service. He contracted with exclusive, organic coffee farms, ensuring that his product remained entirely unmatched. By the 4th month, Maria's Haven was no longer just a popular cafe. It was an elite institution. CEOs of rival tech conglomerates and major venture capital firms began scheduling their most critical, multi-million-dollar meetings at Buford's corner tables, stating that the atmosphere brought good fortune and clear thinking. Buford bought the actual building he was renting, paying the landlord in a lump sum of cash. He then purchased the 2 adjacent properties, expanding the cafe into a massive, multi-room luxury lounge. He sat at his custom oak desk in the back office, reviewing financial ledgers that showed profits surpassing anything he had ever earned in his life. He had rebuilt his empire, not through cold exploitation, but through the pure, unyielding strength of his own character. And from his desk, he watched through the window as the dark, inevitable storm clouds finally began to gather over the black glass tower of Apex Innovations. Ethan's corporate paradise was rotting from the inside out. His absolute arrogance and ruthless management style had finally caught up with him. In his obsession with rapid expansion and cutting costs to maximize short-term profits for his investors, he had cut corners on the development of Apex's flagship software system, a highly anticipated data security platform. 2 weeks prior, during a massive, live-streamed global launch event, the software had suffered a catastrophic systemic failure. Within hours, the personal and financial data of millions of users had been exposed to the public internet. The backlash was immediate, furious, and absolute. Apex Innovations was hit with a barrage of class action lawsuits totaling hundreds of millions of dollars. The federal government launched an immediate investigation into the company's security protocols. Major institutional investors, realizing they had been lied to regarding the readiness of the product, panicked and pulled their funding out of the company overnight. The stock price of Apex Innovations plummeted to near zero, entering a terminal death spiral. Ethan sat in his executive office, which was now completely empty. His administrative assistants had quit. His legal team had abandoned him after his retainers bounced. His business partner, Marcus, had packed his things and fled the state to avoid prosecution, leaving Ethan to take the absolute entirety of the blame. The sleek glass office that had once felt like the top of the world now felt like an execution chamber. The monitors on his desk flickered with red alerts, bankruptcy notices, and liquidation orders. The bank had frozen his personal accounts. His luxury penthouse had been foreclosed upon. His collection of sports cars had been repossessed earlier that morning. He was completely, utterly ruined. He had nothing left but the clothes on his back and the crushing weight of a multi-million-dollar debt that would haunt him for the rest of his natural life. Ethan walked slowly to the window, his hands trembling violently. He looked down through the glass, his eyes landing automatically on the vibrant, bustling oasis of Maria's Haven across the street. Even in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, the cafe was alive with energy. Sleek town cars were parked outside, dropping off wealthy patrons. The golden light from the windows spilled out onto the wet pavement, welcoming everyone who approached. Through the large glass pane, Ethan could see his father. Buford was standing near the front counter, talking to a prominent city councilman. Buford looked immaculate. He wore a perfectly tailored dark charcoal suit, his gray hair neatly styled, his posture upright, powerful, and radiating an unmistakable, effortless authority. He looked like a king in his element, a man who possessed the entire world. A desperate, wild thought flared to life in Ethan's panicked mind, a thought born of absolute terror and a total lack of alternatives. He left his office, the elevators no longer working due to the building's power grid being partially shut down for non-payment. He walked down 50 flights of concrete stairs, his lungs burning, his mind racing. He burst through the main lobby doors of the Apex Tower and stepped out into the pouring rain. He didn't have an umbrella. The cold water immediately soaked through his expensive wool suit, flattening his hair against his forehead, causing his designer shoes to squelch in the puddles. He crossed the street like a ghost, his eyes locked onto the glowing neon sign of his mother's name. The heavy brass bell above the door of Maria's haven chimed with a clear, melodic ring as Ethan pushed his way inside. The sudden transition from the cold, torrential rain to the warm, luxurious interior was jarring. The air was rich with the scent of roasted espresso, hazelnut, and warm butter. The soft, elegant melodies of a classical piano playlist drifted from the hidden surround sound speakers. The moment Ethan entered, the atmosphere in the front room shifted. Customers turned their heads, murmuring in disgust and recognition as they saw the disheveled, soaking wet CEO of the disgraced Apex Innovations standing in the doorway, dripping water onto the pristine, polished hardwood floor. Ethan didn't care about the stairs. He didn't care about his shattered dignity. He walked slowly, unsteadily, toward the center of the room, where the massive oak counter stood. Buford finished his conversation with the councilman, shook his hand warmly, and walked over to the cash register. He stopped, his eyes adjusting to the figure standing across from him. His expression didn't change. There was no shock, no anger, no satisfaction on Buford's face. His eyes were like two pools of deep, unbothered glacial water, completely calm, entirely unreadable, and devoid of any emotion. Ethan stopped at the edge of the counter, gripping the polished wood to keep his hands from shaking. He looked up at his father, his lips trembling, his eyes bloodshot and filled with tears. "Dad," Ethan choked out, his voice a pathetic, broken rasp that sounded entirely foreign to his own ears. "Dad, please, you have to listen to me. I made a horrific mistake. I was blind, Dad. I was young, I was stupid, and I let the greed of the corporate world completely poison my mind. Apex is completely gone. The government is seizing everything. I am completely bankrupt. They took the house, they took my assets, they took everything. I have absolutely nowhere to go. I don't even have enough money to buy a meal or rent a room for tonight." Buford didn't move a single muscle. He stood tall, his arms resting casually against his sides, his gaze fixed onto his son's face with the clinical detachment of a judge examining a piece of evidence. "I am begging you, Dad," Ethan sobbed, the tears now flowing freely down his rain-slicked cheeks. He looked around at the wealthy patrons watching him, but his desperation was too absolute for shame. "I know what I did to you is monstrous. I know I betrayed you in Mom's memory. But I am your son, your only son. You can't just leave me out in the street to starve. Look at this place. You are incredibly successful now. You have an empire here. Please, just give me a chance. I don't need a position of authority. I'll do anything. I'll sweep the floors, I'll wash the dishes, I'll take out the trash, I'll clean the bathrooms. Just give me a job and a place to sleep in the back room. Please, Dad, for the sake of Mom's memory, remember how much she loved me. She wouldn't want to see me like this." The mention of Maria's name, which had once been a weapon Ethan used to slash his father's heart, now hung in the warm air of the cafe like a final test of Buford's resolve. Buford slowly stepped out from behind the massive oak counter. He walked around the perimeter until he was standing directly in front of Ethan. The entire cafe fell into a dead, absolute silence. The baristas stopped pouring coffee. The executives lowered their cups. Every single eye in the room was fixed on the patriarch, waiting for his judgment. Ethan, overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing presence of his father, collapsed. His knees hit the hard oak floorboards with a loud thud. He buried his face in his hands, weeping openly at his father's feet, his wet suit soaking into the wood, a pathetic, broken shell of the arrogant man who had disowned his family 4 months ago. Buford looked down at the boy he had raised. He looked at the tears, the ruined suit, the desperate hands clutching at his trousers. He felt the phantom echo of the pain he had felt in his living room on that fateful afternoon, the day his son had told him he was obsolete and a failure. He remembered the coldness in Ethan's eyes when he had thrown his mother's memory into the dirt. Buford leaned down slightly, bringing his face closer to Ethan's. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but possessed a terrifying, resonant clarity that carried to every single corner of the room, vibrating with the absolute weight of an unshakable finality. "No!" Ethan gasped, his sobbing instantly cutting off as his head snapped up. He stared at his father in absolute, paralyzed shock, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. "Dad, what? No, please. You can't do this to me. I am your own flesh and blood. 4 months ago, in my living room, you looked me in the eyes and told me that family history didn't pay dividends," Buford said, his voice entirely devoid of malice, laced only with an icy, immutable truth. "You told me that I was obsolete, a failure, and a relic of mediocrity. You took the home my wife and I built. You took our memories, and you threw them into the fire of your own boundless arrogance without a single shred of hesitation or mercy. You told me you were making a clean, permanent break for me. I was wrong, Dad. I swear I was wrong." Ethan screamed, reaching out to grab Buford's hand, but Buford smoothly stepped back, out of his reach. "You are not sorry for what you did, Ethan," Buford continued calmly, looking down at him with an expression of profound pity. "You are only sorry that you failed. You are only sorry that the world discovered you were hollow inside. You chose to live by the laws of a cold, ruthless corporate machine, and now you must learn to die by them. You broke the contract of our family. You erased your own lineage for a percentage of profit. I do not have a son anymore. You are merely a stranger standing in my establishment, disrupting the peace of my guests." Buford straightened his posture, turning his back on the kneeling man. He looked at the 2 large, imposing security guards standing near the entrance of the cafe. "Security," Buford commanded, his voice ringed with absolute authority. "Please remove this individual from the premises immediately. He is trespassing, and he is ruining the floors." "Dad, no, please, Dad!" Ethan shrieked as the 2 massive guards stepped forward. They grabbed Ethan by his arms, lifting him effortlessly off the floor. Ethan thrashed and kicked, his face red with a mixture of terror and humiliation, but the guards were unyielding. They dragged him through the center of the cafe, past the staring crowds, and pushed him out through the front doors. Ethan stumbled, falling hard onto the wet, cold concrete sidewalk outside. The heavy glass doors of Maria's haven closed behind him, the brass bell chiming a final, clean note. He lay there in the pouring rain, looking up at the glowing emerald sanctuary, completely cast out, entirely alone, a beggar in the shadow of the father he had tried to destroy. Inside, the cafe instantly returned to life. The patrons began to murmur in hushed, respectful tones, nodding their heads in approval of the patriarch's unflinching justice. The baristas resumed their work, the sound of the espresso machines filling the air once again. Buford walked slowly through the room, his step light, his heart unburdened. He walked over to the mantelpiece near the fireplace, where a beautifully framed, large oil portrait of Maria now hung, bathed in a warm, dedicated spotlight. Her eyes seemed to look down upon the room with a deep, radiant peace. Buford reached up, his fingers gently brushing the edge of the frame. He took a deep, steady breath, a profound sense of closure washing over his soul. He had not just survived the betrayal. He had risen from the ashes, conquered the wilderness of the world, and protected the sacred legacy of the woman he loved. He had won.